The morning sun was soft and golden as it poured over the quiet little town. Life there moved slowly, with neighbors greeting each other at the bakery, shopkeepers setting out their goods, and children running with laughter along the dusty road. In the midst of this calm life was Daniel, a widower who had learned to find comfort in simple routines. He lived at the edge of town with his young daughter, Emily. Every morning, Daniel walked her to the marketplace, holding her small hand in his big, calloused palm. Emily, with her curious eyes, was the light of his life. She had her mother's smile, though her mother had passed away years ago. Daniel's days were filled with work and parenting, but deep inside, he carried a quiet ache that only Emily's laughter could soothe. That morning seemed like any other until a strange sound rose above the usual noise of merchants and animals. It was the clinking of chains. At first, Daniel thought it was just someone unloading tools or iron goods, but the sound grew louder and heavier. A murmur rippled through the crowd. People left their stalls and stepped closer to the center of the square. Children stopped playing, staring wide-eyed. Daniel lifted Emily into his arms to keep her above the growing crowd. And that was when he saw her, the woman who would change everything. She was thin, her clothes torn and filthy, her hair tangled like a bird's nest. Shackles bound her wrists and ankles, and two men led her by a chain as though she were some dangerous animal. The crowd gasped and whispered, some in disgust, some in fear. "A criminal," someone muttered. "She must have done something terrible." Another person spat on the ground as the woman passed. Daniel studied her face. It was pale, and her lips trembled as though she could collapse at any moment. She didn't look like a monster. She looked like a human being who had suffered too much. Emily tugged at his sleeve, her little voice breaking the heavy silence around them. "Daddy, is she dying?" The words rang louder than anything else in Daniel's ears. People nearby turned to stare at Emily with surprise, but Daniel just held her close. The woman stumbled, almost falling, and the guards pulled her roughly to her feet. Her bare feet were bleeding, leaving small red marks on the dusty ground. Daniel felt something twist inside him. Most people looked at her with harsh judgment, but he couldn't ignore the weakness in her steps, the emptiness in her eyes. She looked as though she had been walking for days without food, without hope. Emily whispered again, her voice shaking. "Daddy, can't we help her?" Daniel looked down at his daughter. She was only a child, yet her heart already carried more compassion than most of the adults around them. He brushed a strand of hair from her face and kissed her forehead. "Sometimes, Emily, the world forgets that people are still people." He said it quietly, but those words began to root themselves in his own mind. The guards dragged the woman toward the town hall, where the mayor and council often made decisions about punishment and justice. People followed, eager to see what would happen. Daniel, still holding Emily's hand, followed at a distance. His heart pounded as he listened to the crowd. Some wanted her locked away, others wanted her banished. Nobody asked about her story. Nobody asked why she was chained in the first place. Inside the hall, the air felt heavy. The mayor stood tall, his voice stern. "This woman has been brought here for stealing from a merchant. She was caught hiding bread in her clothes. She refused to say her name or where she came from. She has been punished already, but we must decide if she is to be sent away or kept in the prison." Daniel watched her closely. The woman's head hung low, her body swaying with exhaustion. She said nothing. No plea, no defense, no explanation. It was as if her spirit had already been broken long ago. Emily clutched Daniel's coat, her eyes wide. "She looks so sad, Daddy." The council argued for a while. Some wanted her gone, saying she would bring trouble. Others said she was no use to the town. In the end, they decided she would stay in prison until someone claimed responsibility for her. Daniel's chest tightened. He had never stepped into such matters before. He was just a farmer, a father raising his daughter quietly. But something in him stirred. Emily's innocent question echoed in his mind. Is she dying? When the guards began to drag her away again, Daniel raised his hand. The crowd turned to look at him in surprise. "Wait," he said. His voice was calm but firm. "If she must stay, then let her stay under my care." A wave of murmurs spread across the room. People whispered his name, some laughed, some shook their heads. "Daniel has lost his mind," one man said.
"Why take in a thief?"
another woman asked. The mayor frowned. "Are you certain of this, Daniel? It will bring shame on your house. People will not trust you." Daniel stood tall, his hand still on Emily's shoulder. "A person who steals bread is not a danger. Hunger is. If she has no one, then I will take her. My daughter asked me if she is dying. I cannot stand by and let that be true. For a long moment, silence filled the hall. Then the mayor nodded reluctantly. Very well. She will be under your care. But if she causes trouble, it will be your responsibility. The guards released her chains, though the iron cuffs still clung to her wrists. She stumbled forward and Daniel caught her before she fell. Her skin was cold, her body weak. Emily looked up at her with wide eyes and whispered softly, "You'll be safe now." Daniel brought her home that evening. The town watched as he walked through the streets with the chained woman and his little daughter beside him. People muttered and pointed, but Daniel kept his head high. At home, he set out bread and water. The woman hesitated, staring at the food as if it were some trick. Emily gently pushed the cup of water toward her. "Please drink," she said. For the first time, the woman's eyes softened. She took a sip, her hands trembling. Then Daniel went to the chest where his late wife's belongings were kept. He brought out a simple blue dress, clean and soft, something untouched by time. He placed it before her. "These chains will not define you here. Tomorrow you will wear this instead." The woman looked at the dress, her lips parting as though she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Tears welled in her eyes, silent but heavy. She pressed her hand against her chest as if trying to remember how it felt to be treated as human. Finally, in a fragile whisper, she spoke the only words she could manage. "I don't have a name." Daniel's heart ached, but he knew this was only the beginning. That night, as Emily drifted to sleep with her little hand curled around his arm, Daniel sat awake, staring into the dark. A woman once chained and nameless now rested under his roof. He didn't know what storms would come, but one thing was certain. This was the start of a story that would change all of their lives forever. The next morning, Daniel woke to the sound of birds singing outside his window. He sat up slowly, his mind heavy with the events of the day before. The woman was still in his home, a stranger who had arrived in chains, someone the whole town distrusted. For a moment he wondered if he had done the right thing. But then he looked over at Emily, who was still sleeping peacefully, her small face soft and innocent. He remembered her words, "Daddy, is she dying?" And he knew he could not regret his choice. When Daniel went into the kitchen, he found the woman sitting quietly by the fire. She was still wearing the torn clothes from the day before, but the iron cuffs had been removed. Her hands trembled as she held them close to the fire for warmth. She looked up at him quickly, almost fearfully, as though she expected anger or punishment. Daniel only nodded gently. Emily rushed in a few moments later, her hair messy from sleep. When she saw the woman, she smiled brightly. "Good morning," she chirped, as if this guest had always been part of their family. The woman stared at her, confused by such kindness. Daniel placed bread on the table. "Eat," he said softly. "You are safe here." The woman hesitated, her eyes darting between Daniel and Emily, but hunger finally won. She ate slowly, carefully, as if she was not used to having food given freely. Emily leaned on the table, watching her with interest. "Do you have a name?" she asked with childlike innocence. The woman froze, her eyes wide. She lowered the bread from her lips and shook her head faintly. "No," she whispered, her voice rough from silence. Emily gasped softly. "Everyone has a name," she said. Daniel looked at the woman and spoke calmly. "If you don't have one, we will give you one." He glanced at Emily, who grinned as if it were a game. "What should we call her?" Emily thought for a long moment before her eyes lit up. "Grace," she said happily, "because she looks like someone who needs grace." Daniel repeated it softly, as though testing the sound. "Grace." The woman's eyes filled with tears. She touched her chest, whispering it again, as if the word was a gift she had never thought she could receive. Grace. The days that followed were not easy. Grace struggled with every little thing. She jumped at sudden sounds, flinched when doors closed too loudly, and often stayed silent for hours. At night, Daniel sometimes heard her crying quietly in the small room he had given her. Emily, however, was determined to bring her out of her shell. She would sit by Grace's side, drawing pictures, telling stories, and even placing flowers in her lap. "You're my new friend," she said one afternoon. Grace looked at her in disbelief, her lips trembling before finally smiling. A small, uncertain smile, but a smile nonetheless. Daniel watched all of this quietly. He saw how Emily's innocence and warmth slowly chipped away at the walls Grace had built around herself. He also noticed the way Grace looked at the dress he had given her. She hadn't worn it yet, still clinging to her rags as though she didn't believe she deserved better. One evening, Daniel placed the dress gently over the chair beside her bed. "It belongs to you now," he said firmly. She lowered her gaze, whispering, "I don't want to spoil it." Daniel shook his head. "A dress is meant to be worn. You are no less than anyone else." The next morning, when Grace appeared in the kitchen, she was wearing the blue dress. It was slightly loose on her, but it transformed her completely. Emily clapped her hands in delight. "You look beautiful," she cried. Grace's cheeks flushed red, and for the first time she laughed softly, a sound that seemed fragile but full of life. While Grace was finding a place in Daniel's home, the town was buzzing with gossip. Neighbors whispered behind his back. "He's gone mad taking in a thief," one woman said. "It's not safe," another agreed. Men in the tavern shook their heads, calling him foolish for trusting a criminal, but Daniel ignored their words. He knew what he had seen in Grace's eyes: pain, hunger, and the desperate longing for mercy. One afternoon, Daniel took Grace and Emily to the garden behind their home. The earth there had been neglected since his wife's passing. He handed Grace a small spade and showed her how to loosen the soil. Emily skipped around planting seeds with excitement. Grace's hands shook at first, but as she worked in the dirt, something in her seemed to ease. The warmth of the sun on her face, the smell of fresh soil, and Emily's laughter all began to stitch together the pieces of a life she thought she had lost forever. As days turned to weeks, Grace started to learn. Emily taught her simple words by pointing at objects in the house: chair, table, window, and Grace repeated them with care. Daniel noticed her curiosity, the way she listened closely and tried hard to remember everything. At night, Emily would sit with Grace by the fire, reading simple stories aloud. Grace listened with wide eyes, whispering the words under her breath. Still, not everything was smooth. One evening, when Daniel returned from the market, he found Grace outside, sitting on the steps with her head in her hands. She had overheard the neighbors mocking her again, calling her the chained one and the nameless thief. Daniel sat beside her quietly. "They don't know you," he said. Grace looked up, tears streaming down her face. "They are right. I am nothing." Daniel shook his head firmly. "You are not nothing. You are Grace. You are learning, living, and you are more than the mistakes behind you. My daughter sees it, and so do I." Grace looked at him for a long time, searching for any sign of doubt, but all she saw was steady kindness. She lowered her gaze, whispering, "I don't understand why you help me." Daniel sighed softly. "Because everyone deserves a second chance. And because Emily was right, you were dying. Not in body, but in spirit. You needed life again." From that night on, Grace began to change little by little. She laughed more, worked harder in the garden, and even began to cook small meals with Emily's help. She was still quiet, still carrying scars from her past, but she no longer looked like the broken, nameless woman who had come into town in chains. She was slowly becoming someone new. For Daniel, watching this transformation stirred feelings he hadn't expected. He saw in Grace the reflection of his own grief and loss. Just as he had lived through sorrow after his wife's death, she had lived through her own despair. Together, under one roof, they were finding pieces of healing. Emily, in her innocence, had unknowingly woven them together like threads in a cloth. But outside their home, suspicion still grew. The townsfolk watched closely, waiting for Grace to make a mistake, to prove their whispers true. Daniel knew storms were coming. Yet as he looked at Grace working beside Emily in the fading light of evening, he felt a certainty deep in his heart. This woman, once nameless and chained, now had a chance to live again. And he would protect that chance no matter what it cost. Grace stood at the small wooden table, her hands resting on the smooth surface as morning light poured through the window. She was wearing the blue dress Daniel had given her, and although it was still slightly loose on her thin frame, it gave her a dignity she hadn't felt in years. She turned her head toward the sound of soft footsteps. Emily came bounding into the room, her arms filled with papers covered in scribbles and small drawings. "Look, Grace," she said with excitement. "I drew us. This is me, Daddy, and you." Grace bent down and took the paper gently. Her eyes filled with tears as she saw 3 smiling figures holding hands, standing under a bright sun. She touched the figure that Emily had drawn of her, whispering the name Daniel and Emily had given her. "Grace." The sound of it still felt unreal, like a dream she was afraid she would wake from. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Emily hugged her tightly, and for the first time, Grace did not pull away. Daniel entered soon after, carrying a basket of vegetables from the garden. He paused at the doorway, watching the moment silently. A warmth spread through his chest as he saw the bond forming between the woman who had once arrived in chains and his little girl. He set the basket down. "Grace," Muddy said gently, "today we'll start something new. I want you to help me in the fields. Emily can come too." Grace froze for a moment. The idea of working openly in the fields where neighbors could see her filled her with fear. But Daniel's calm, steady eyes reassured her. "You are not a prisoner here," he said. "You're part of this home. If the town sees you working, they will also see you living." Later that day, the three of them walked together to the field. The earth was ready for planting, and Daniel handed Grace a small hoe. At first, her hands shook, unsure of the task. But Daniel showed her patiently, guiding her movements. Emily ran back and forth, placing seeds in the furrows. As the sun climbed higher, Grace began to relax. She felt the soil between her fingers, the warmth of the sun on her back, and the steady rhythm of honest work. For the first time in a long time, she felt useful. When they returned to the house in the evening, Grace surprised herself by smiling. Her dress was dusty, her hands sore, but her heart was lighter. Emily ran to fetch a book, and the two of them sat together by the fire. Emily read aloud in her sweet, careful voice, pointing at words and encouraging Grace to repeat them. At first, Grace stumbled over the letters, but Emily cheered for every small success. Daniel, watching from his chair, felt a quiet pride. Grace was not just surviving anymore, she was learning, growing, becoming someone new. Yet not everyone in town saw it that way. At the marketplace, whispers followed Daniel whenever he appeared with Grace. "There goes the farmer and his thief," someone muttered. "She'll bring him nothing but trouble." Grace heard the words, her head lowering with shame. Daniel placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Hold your head high," he told her. "You have nothing to be ashamed of." But one evening, trouble came to their doorstep. A loud knock shook the wooden door. When Daniel opened it, 3 townspeople stood outside, their faces stern. "We want to speak to you," one of them said sharply. "It's about her." They gestured toward Grace, who was standing quietly in the corner. "There's been a theft," the man continued. "A merchant's goods went missing yesterday, and people saw her near the market. You've brought danger into this town." Grace's heart raced. She had gone to the market the day before to fetch water with Emily, but she had taken nothing. Still, her voice trembled as she tried to speak. "I didn't," she began, but the townsfolk cut her off. "Once a thief, always a thief," another said coldly. Emily rushed forward, her little face red with anger. "She didn't steal anything." Grace would never. Daniel stepped between the townsfolk and his home. His voice was calm, but his presence was strong. "You have no proof," he said firmly. "Do not come here accusing an innocent woman. If you want to speak further, do it with truth, not suspicion." The men muttered among themselves, clearly unhappy, but they left. Inside, Grace sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face. "They hate me," she whispered. "They will never see me as anything but what I was." Daniel knelt beside her, his voice steady. "Do not let their voices decide who you are. They see only chains, but I see more. Emily sees more. You are Grace. That is enough." The very next day, the truth came out. The real thief was discovered, none other than the wealthy merchant's son who had hidden stolen goods to cover his gambling debts. The town was shaken with shame. Some people muttered apologies to Daniel, but most avoided Grace altogether, unwilling to admit how quickly they had judged her. Grace heard the whispers but did not respond. Deep inside, though, she felt a fragile strength beginning to grow. Life continued quietly in Daniel's home. Grace began to take on more tasks. She learned to sew from scraps of old fabric, mending Emily's torn clothes. At first the stitches were uneven, but soon her fingers grew skilled and precise. Emily twirled in the simple dresses Grace made, clapping her hands in delight. "You're amazing, Grace," she would exclaim. Grace blushed, unused to praise, but Daniel smiled proudly. In the evenings, Grace began to hum softly while working, her voice carrying a melody from a time long past. Emily listened with wonder. "Sing more," she would beg, and Grace would sing quietly, her voice like a fragile thread weaving through the house. Daniel often paused in his work, listening silently, the sound stirring memories of his late wife but also filling him with a new sense of peace. One night, Grace sat by the fire and spoke of her past for the first time. Her voice was low, almost broken. She told Daniel how she had once belonged to a traveling family, how sickness and poverty had taken everything from her, how she had wandered alone, hungry, and desperate. "I thought I had no worth left," she whispered. "That I was nothing but a burden." Daniel listened without interruption. When she finished, he looked at her steadily. "Your past does not define your future," he said. "The chains they put on you are gone. What matters now is what you choose to do with the life before you." Grace lowered her gaze, tears glistening in her eyes, but deep inside, she felt a small flame of hope. As days turned to weeks, Daniel saw more changes in her. She no longer hid when townsfolk walked past their home. She greeted Emily with smiles and laughter. She even began to tease Daniel gently when he made mistakes in the field. Each moment was small, but together they painted a picture of a woman rediscovering life. But Daniel also knew that trust was fragile. The town's suspicion had not disappeared entirely. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting for Grace to stumble, waiting for him to regret his choice. Yet when he looked at her, sitting beside Emily and stitching another dress, he knew there was no regret. There was only conviction. Grace, once nameless and broken, was now part of something larger, part of a home, part of a family, and perhaps part of a future filled with light. And though storms still loomed on the horizon, Daniel believed they could face them together. For Grace was no longer a woman in chains. She was Grace, alive, learning, and slowly stepping into the second life she had been given. The days in Daniel's home began to take on a rhythm, almost like music. Grace helped in the garden, cooked simple meals, and spent evenings by the fire with Emily, learning new words and stories. The little girl adored her, clinging to her side as though she had always been part of their family. Daniel, too, found himself smiling more often. The house no longer felt silent and empty. It was filled with voices, laughter, and the gentle warmth of companionship. But peace is fragile, and it wasn't long before shadows crept in again. One morning, Daniel walked to the market with Emily and Grace. The sky was bright, and Emily skipped ahead with her basket, humming cheerfully. Grace stayed close to Daniel, her eyes lowered, still nervous of the stares that followed her. Some townsfolk looked away, pretending not to see, while others whispered openly. Daniel ignored them, buying grain and fruit as though nothing was amiss. But trouble came quickly. When they reached the far end of the market, a crowd had gathered. A merchant was shouting angrily, "My money is gone! Someone stole from my stall." His face was red with fury, and he pointed wildly. People turned, searching for someone to blame. Grace stiffened when she felt the weight of their eyes on her. "There she is," a voice cried. "The chained woman. It must have been her," the crowd murmured in agreement. "Who else would it be? She has stolen before." Daniel was a fool to bring her here. The accusations rose louder and louder until they filled the square. Grace shook her head desperately. "I didn't take anything," she whispered, but her voice was drowned out by the angry shouts. Emily ran to her side, clinging to her hand. "She didn't do it," the little girl cried, tears brimming in her eyes. "Grace didn't steal anything." Daniel stepped forward, his tall frame casting a shadow over the crowd. His voice was calm but carried the strength of conviction. "Enough," he said firmly. "You have no proof. You point fingers at her because of her past, not because of what happened today. If there has been a theft, find the truth before you accuse the innocent." The merchant scowled. "Are you saying my goods vanished on their own?" Daniel met his gaze without flinching. "I am saying you will not blame the woman under my care without evidence." The crowd wavered, some muttering in disapproval, others looking uncertain. Grace's heart pounded. She clutched Emily's hand, fighting the shame that threatened to crush her. The voices of doubt felt heavier than any chains she had worn before. Daniel guided both Grace and Emily away from the square, his head held high though the whispers followed them all the way home. That evening, Grace sat by the fire, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. She felt the old weight of hopelessness returning. "They'll never forgive me," she whispered. "No matter what I do, they'll always see me as a thief." Daniel knelt beside her, his hand steady on her shoulder. "Listen to me," he said. "Their judgment is not the truth. You are more than what they say. You are Grace, you are alive, learning, and you belong here." Emily wrapped her little arms around Grace's waist. "I believe you," she said fiercely. "And Daddy does too." Grace buried her face in her hands, trembling. She could not remember the last time anyone had defended her so strongly. She had lived so long under suspicion that kindness felt like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. The truth came out only a few days later. The merchant's own son had taken the money, hiding it to cover debts he dared not admit to. When the theft was discovered, the townsfolk fell into uneasy silence. Some were ashamed for accusing Grace so quickly, but most simply looked away, unwilling to admit their cruelty. Daniel said nothing to them. He only stood taller, his quiet strength making it clear that he would not allow Grace to be treated as less than human again. Grace herself said little, though inside her heart stirred with both relief and sorrow. Relief that she had been proven innocent, sorrow that so many had been eager to see her fall. From then on, Daniel noticed a change in her. She worked harder, pouring herself into sewing, cooking, and tending the garden. She no longer cried at night, though her eyes sometimes carried a distant sadness. She had begun to fight, not with anger but with determination to live, to prove that she was worthy of the life she had been given. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of gold, Grace sat outside with Daniel. Emily was chasing fireflies nearby, her laughter ringing through the air. Grace's voice was soft when she finally spoke. When I was in chains, I stopped hoping. I told myself I deserved nothing, but now I don't know how to carry this gift you've given me. I don't know how to live with freedom. Daniel turned to her, his eyes steady. Freedom is not easy, he said. It comes with fear and responsibility, but it also comes with choice. Every day you wake up, you have the chance to choose who you are. You chose kindness when you cared for Emily. You chose honesty when you stayed silent against lies. That is what freedom means. Grace lowered her gaze, her lips trembling. And if I fail? Then you stand up again, Daniel replied. Because that is what life is. Falling, standing, and learning to walk stronger each time. Grace nodded slowly, his words settling into her heart like seeds in fertile soil. She looked at Emily, who was now holding out her hands to show the glowing light of a captured firefly. In that moment, Grace felt a spark of something she had not felt in years, hope. But the world outside their home had not softened completely. People still whispered and some still avoided her. Daniel knew the road ahead would not be easy. Grace's place in the community would always be questioned. Yet, as he looked at her sitting quietly in the glow of sunset, he knew that the most important change had already begun. Grace no longer saw herself only as a prisoner of her past. She was beginning to see herself as someone who deserved a future. That night, as Emily fell asleep with Grace's hand resting gently on her hair, Daniel sat by the fire. He thought of the day she had arrived in chains, broken and silent. Now she sat in his home with a name, address, and a place by the hearth. The town could whisper all it wanted. To Daniel and Emily, she was not a thief, not a burden, but part of their family. Grace had begun her second life, and though trials would surely come again, Daniel knew she would no longer face them alone. The winter frost had melted and spring painted the little town with bright colors. Trees stretched with new leaves, flowers bloomed along fences, and the air smelled fresh with the promise of new beginnings. In Daniel's home, life also seemed to blossom. Grace, once silent and broken, now moved with purpose. She wore simple dresses she had stitched with her own hands, and her hair was no longer tangled but neatly tied back. Her eyes still carried shadows of her past, but they also held a quiet strength that was impossible to miss. Each morning began the same. Daniel worked in the fields, Emily gathered eggs from the chickens, and Grace prepared breakfast. She hummed softly as she kneaded bread, a tune Emily loved to listen to. Sometimes Emily would join in, making up silly words to match Grace's melody, and laughter would fill the little kitchen. Daniel often paused outside the window just to listen. He knew this was what his late wife would have wanted, for the house to be alive again, filled with warmth and love. As the days grew warmer, Grace's sewing skills caught attention. It had begun with small mending jobs, patching a torn sleeve, stitching an apron. But soon her hands learned to create more. She cut old cloth into neat shapes and pieced them together into dresses for Emily. One afternoon, Emily twirled in a yellow dress Grace had made, her laughter ringing through the street. Neighbors turned to look, surprised at the neatness and beauty of the work. A few days later, a woman from town came quietly to Daniel's door, asking if Grace might mend her shawl. Grace did so carefully, returning it as good as new. Word spread slowly but surely. More neighbors came, some with torn clothes, others curious to see what Grace could create. At first they were cautious, still whispering about her past. But when they saw the fine stitches, the steady hand, and the honesty with which she worked, their doubt began to soften. Grace never overcharged, and often she refused payment entirely, asking only for scraps of cloth to continue her craft. What had begun as a way to keep busy soon became her gift to the community. One afternoon, Emily ran into the house, her eyes wide with excitement. "Grace, guess what? Mrs. Turner said you make the best dresses in town. She said she wants to buy one for her niece." Grace's hands froze on the cloth she was cutting. She looked at Daniel uncertainly, her lips trembling. They trust me?" she whispered. Daniel nodded, his eyes warm. "They are beginning to see you as I do. Not as someone chained to the past, but as someone with skill, with value, with life." Grace swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the thought. All her life she had been seen as a burden, a problem, or worse, a criminal. Now people were asking for her work, respecting her talent. It felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. That night she sat long after Emily had gone to bed, staring at her hands. Once these hands had been bound in chains. Now they created beauty. She whispered to herself, "I have a purpose." But even as her reputation grew, some in town remained stubborn. A few people still avoided her in the marketplace, muttering under their breath. Daniel noticed, and it made his jaw tighten, but Grace surprised him with her calm. "Let them speak," she said softly one evening as they sat by the fire. "I used to believe every cruel word. Now I know they don't define me. I know who I am." Daniel looked at her in silence, filled with admiration. She had come so far from the frightened woman who had first stepped into his home. Emily, meanwhile, clung to Grace with the love only a child could give. She followed her everywhere, watching her sew, helping her cook, even falling asleep on her lap by the fire. One evening, Emily looked up at Grace and asked, "Can I call you my other mother?" Grace froze, tears springing to her eyes. She bent down and hugged the child tightly. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, you can." The bond between them grew deeper each day. Daniel saw it clearly. The way Emily leaned on Grace for comfort, the way Grace softened in Emily's presence. He knew Emily's innocence had been the first step in Grace's healing. Where the world had seen only chains, Emily had seen a friend, a person worth saving. That childlike love had cracked open a heart that had been locked away for years. Seasons changed, and Grace's small sewing corner turned into a little shop. Daniel built her a wooden table near the front of the house, and townsfolk began to come regularly, bringing cloth, asking for dresses, aprons, or even curtains. Grace worked quietly, always humble, but with growing confidence. She learned to smile at her customers, even laugh sometimes, and each finished piece carried not only her skill but her heart. There came a day when the mayor himself came to see her. He stood in the doorway looking awkward and asked if she could sew something for his wife. Grace's hands trembled as she agreed, but when she presented the finished gown weeks later, the mayor's wife praised it openly at a gathering. From then on, even those who had doubted the longest began to soften. Slowly, the chains of judgment broke, replaced by respect. One evening, as the sun set and the sky glowed in shades of red and gold, Daniel sat outside with Grace and Emily. Emily was playing with a doll Grace had sewn for her, giggling as she made it dance. Grace looked at Daniel quietly and said, "I never thought I would live to see this. I thought my life ended the day I was chained. But you gave me a name, a dress, and a chance to live again." Daniel's voice was steady. "You gave yourself this life, Grace. I only opened the door. You chose to walk through it." Grace looked at him, her eyes shining with gratitude. For years she had carried only shame, but now she carried dignity, purpose, and love. Emily climbed into her lap, holding up the doll proudly. "See, Daddy? Grace makes everything better." Daniel chuckled softly, but deep in his heart he knew Emily was right. Grace had brought light into their lives just as much as they had given her a second chance. As stars appeared in the sky, Grace whispered to herself words she once thought she'd never say. "I'm not chained anymore." Her second life had begun, not with riches or glory, but with something far greater. A family, a name, and the freedom to be loved.